Tonight, we drift into a land where shadows whispered secrets onto parchment, and stars dictated more than fate. Welcome to medieval Andalusia, a place where the night sky wasn't just admired, was studied, feared, charted, and argued over by men in robes who hadn't slept in days. You might know it as southern Spain, but from the 8th to the 15th century, it was a realm of minarets, calligraphy, and celestial obsession, a melting pot of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars who didn't always get along, but when they did, they built observatories instead of armies. So fluff your pillow, sip something warm, and let's journey back to a time when astronomy wasn't a science, yet it was a spiritual responsibility, a way of reading God's diary, one constellation at a time. The year is 978 CE. The Caliphate of Cordoba is nearing its peak. Gold flows, libraries swell, markets hum like lullabies, and tucked behind a spice merchant's stall, a boy is squinting at the crescent moon through a bronze tube that looks suspiciously like plumbing equipment. His name won't make the textbooks. Most don't, but tonight, you'll hear from the forgotten class of dreamers, the astronomers whose names were footnotes sometimes erased altogether. Let's begin in the shadow of Cordoba's great mosque, where the city smells of ink, cumin, and goat. The mosque isn't just for prayers, it's a hub, a meeting place, a school, a cafe without coffee. Scholars pace slowly under its arches, discussing planetary retrograde motion with the seriousness of war generals. Their robes whisper against marble floors as they debate whether Mars is angry or merely misunderstood. And in the outer courtyard, young students balance wooden astrolabes like delicate fruit, eyes scanning heaven's messy handwriting. The sky, to them, isn't beautiful, it's confusing. The sun sets early in winter, casting long golden beams through the mosque's colonnades. Light and shadow move across sandstone like hourglasses tipped sideways. That's when the real work begins, because in Andalusia, astronomy was nocturnal. The stars were teachers, but only if you stayed up late. If you walk behind the mosque and follow the scent of olive oil and candle wax, you'll reach a door most people never noticed. Beyond it, the Madrasah Observatory, a cramped stone chamber with a domed roof and a narrow slit that pointed at Polaris. There is no telescope. Glass that bends light hasn't been perfected yet. Instead, they use the Zaja collection of star charts, trigonometry, and hand-copied data from Babylonian clay tablets. Each night, scholars gather, heads bowed, not in prayer but calculation. They chant numbers, not verses. They scribble until their fingers cramp. They argue over the angle of Venus. They sigh heavily when clouds roll in. It's quiet, except for the scratch of red pens and the occasional sneeze into a linen sleeve. And when the muezzin's call echoes through the city, at dawn, they rise stiffly from the floor, their minds filled with orbits, declinations, and geometric proofs that make more sense upside down. But don't be fooled. This wasn't just stargazing for fun. In the Islamic Golden Age, the heavens mattered. You had to know where Mecca was, exactly, not roughly, not vaguely, eastward. The Qibla, or direction of prayer, had to be astronomically calculated down to the degree souls depended on it. So the astronomers worked, not for prestige, not for gold, but because people needed to face the right direction 5 times a day. And compasses didn't speak Arabic yet. Meanwhile, another group of scholars sat hunched over charts of eclipses. They weren't predicting doomsday, they were timing rainfall. Harvests, tax collection, calendars were sacred. If you got the new moon wrong, An entire village might fast on the wrong day, or miss Eid altogether. That's not just a mistake, it's a sin, so they watched the sky every night, year after year. Their tools were crude by modern standards. Strings, rods, dials etched by hand. A well-made astrolabe could take 6 months to carve. Each one was part instrument, part devotion. Most scholars were unpaid. Some were blind in one eye. Others were so hunched they could draw circles without bending. They memorized the works of Ptolemy, translated into Arabic, annotated again in Persian, then corrected an Andalusian Arabica dialect so precise it could differentiate 4 types of sunrise. But this wasn't plagiarism. It was reverence. To copy was to honor. To improve was expected. So they argued with Ptolemy, not rudely but thoroughly. Some insisted the earth might wobble. Others believed the stars were moving faster than Ptolemy guessed. And if you think, flat earthers are a new invention, surprised they existed then too, and were swiftly laughed out of the observatory. Still, the astronomers weren't above mistakes. One poor soul miscalculated the moon's perigee and caused an entire region to celebrate Ramadan a day early. His punishment wasn't death. It was worse. He had to hand-copy the entire book of fixed stars by candlelight, with commentary. Now, let's zoom out. Andalusia wasn't the only stargazing region. Baghdad, Samarkand, and Cairo had their own observatories. But Cordoba's scholars were unique. They had access to Latin texts smuggled in from monasteries in the north. So while others were debating Saturn's moods, these scholars were learning Euclidean geometry from dusty Christian monks with excellent penmanship. It wasn't harmony. It was academic theft, but also collaboration. And for a brief century or two, knowledge didn't care what god you prayed to. There's something strangely peaceful about imagining it. Scholars of every background arguing over the exact diameter of the moon, while outside, empires rise and fall. No one noticed the astronomers. That was fine with them. They weren't looking down anyway. One particularly meticulous man, Ibrahim ibn Yahya al-Naqash, kept 30 years of sky logs written on goatskin. They were lost in a fire. Only a single page survived, tucked inside a spice merchant's book. Ledger, another, Lady Miriam of Toledo, worked in secret, disguised as her brother's assistant. She's credited with correcting the inclination of the ecliptic by 1/2 degree. Her notes were discovered centuries later, purposed as binding for a legal document. These aren't myths. They're just forgotten, because when the Reconquista began and Christian kingdoms swept southward, astronomy fell out of favor. Astrology remained. But the empirical science, the calculations, the arguments sit all dimmed. Some astronomers fled. Others burned their own manuscripts rather than hand them over. The observatory became a wine cellar. The astrolabes were melted into buttons, and the night sky went back to being mysterious. But not for long. Later, the Renaissance would rediscover those same star charts, preserved in translation, misfiled in monasteries, and scribbled into margins. Andalusia's quiet minds had shaped Europe's scientific awakening, and yet their names were rarely credited. So tonight, as you settle deeper into sleep, let your mind drift through the dim halls of that forgotten observatory. Hear the creak of sandalwood drawers, smell the oil lamps, listen to the patient calculations. They weren't chasing fame, they were chasing clarity, not to conquer the stars, but to understand them, and in doing so, they left behind not monuments, but margins. not statues, but equations, whispered in ink beneath a sky that never once repeated itself. The air in the hills outside Toledo feels thinner as night falls. Cypress trees lean like quiet listeners, and the sun surrenders to a vault of sky so dark it could swallow entire thoughts. But to those who watched the heavens for a living, the real sky didn't begin until the light disappeared. Among the terraced gardens and cobbled courtyards, a flickering lamp lights up a modest rooftop. Not a palace, not a cathedral, just a tiled platform, reinforced with sandbags and stone, where the breeze smells of lavender and candle smoke. This is where they gathered now. The old school, the ones whose masters had been exiled or buried. The next generation of Andalusian astronomers who no longer worked under caliphal funding or public praise. Their observatories had turned to ruins, their instruments confiscated, but not their knowledge. They met in private merchants by day, stargazers by night. Hushed footsteps, cloaked shadows, and ink smuggled from the back alleys of Cordoba. They whispered in Castilian, scribbled in Arabic, and prayed in Latin, but they looked at the same stars. Always tonight they were mapping an eclipse, not for omens, not for mysticism, for pattern. Because if the moon obeyed rhythm, then the world, too, might still be predictable. A young man named Yusuf held the astrolabe steady while his teacher, an aging Jewish scholar named Ben Shmuel, muttered figures. Under his breath, the old man had once stood before an entire class in Seville, explaining solar declination with sand and shadow. Now he worked in silence, beneath a sheet of canvas tied down with rope. Next to them, a girl no older than 17, etched a diagram into a flat slab of beeswax. Her name was Soraya. Nobody knew her last name. Perhaps even she had forgotten it. Her father had been arrested for copying Persian commentaries. She had fled north with only a worn satchel and a half-completed Zij manuscript. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was usually to correct someone's numbers. Tonight, the numbers pointed to a total lunar eclipse. But the old charts didn't agree on the timing. They argued softly, politely, the kind of debate where you bow slightly after disagreeing, not because you must, but because it's harder to raise your voice when your heart still kneels to the discipline you love. They worked until the lamps ran out of oil. Then Yusuf stood and pointed, quietly, and there it was, the earth's shadow slipping across, the moon like a curtain drawn by unseen fingers. No crowds cheered, no bells rang, just a silence so complete that even the cicadas seemed to pause, because in that moment they had done it, predicted nature's rhythm, confirmed it, aligned intellect with cosmos, and then, with tired backs and half-frozen fingers, they returned to their hiding places. Not all astronomers fled Andalusia during the political purges. Some adapted, changed their titles, called themselves timekeepers instead, or architects, or builders of water clocks. One man, Ahmad al-Madriti, cleverly rewrote Ptolemaic texts into architectural treatises, embedding star tables into diagrams for city planners. He lived long enough to see his student take the method even further, smuggling celestial math into agricultural guides. You couldn't arrest a farmer for needing the equinox, could you? It was a delicate rebellion. They weren't warriors. They were librarians with stubborn spines the caliphate had fractured. Christian kingdoms encroached from the north, and in the south, local rulers fought for power with swords. Not scholarship books burned more easily than cities, and yet the astronomers persisted. Some took jobs charting time for public prayer. Others mapped irrigation cycles, but always they carried copies, quietly, faithfully. One scholar stitched a diagram of Saturn's orbit into the lining of his robe. Another recited the positions of the fixed stars each night like a lullaby, so if his books were seized, he could write them again from memory. But this isn't just a tale of survival. It's also a story of slow rediscovery, because across the Mediterranean, in Italy and France, something was beginning. Monks dusted off old Latin translations of Arabic works texts that had been hidden in abbey cellars or carried by travelers from Toledo. They didn't always understand them. Some misread entire passages, but they were fascinated. A scholar named Gerard of Cremona journeyed to Spain not to sightsee, but to find a copy of Ptolemy's Almagest. He found more than he ever expected. Over 70 scientific works preserved by Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars alike. He translated feverishly, one after another, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, logic, but names were often lost in translation. Ibn Rushd became Averroes, Al-Zarqali became Arzachiel, Albertani became Albert Igneous. The vowels shifted. The credits vanished, and with them, the memory of the Andalusian observatories dimmed. But their influence didn't. Centuries later, Copernicus would cite tables built in Muslim Spain. Galileo would study diagrams originally drawn under Kepler's laws were sharpened by methods refined in the dust of Cordoba. And yet, no monument stood for these predecessors. No statues, no plaques, just crumbling foundations beneath modern apartments and glass cases in quiet museums labeled anonymous. Let's return to Soraya for a moment. She would grow old in hiding. She never married. She never published under her name. But her notes bundled in waxed linen and tucked into a cedar box were passed from hand to hand. A Jesuit priest brought them north. A Dutch merchant copied them into Latin. A French astronomer, decades later, found them misfiled in a medical archive. He marveled at the diagrams, called them genius, never wondered who wrote them, but Soraya's wax tablet still sits in a drawer at a university in Salamanca. Unlabeled, unread, but intact it bears the marks of a stylus held with nervous precision. The margins contain notes in both Arabic and Hebrew, and the center, a perfectly calculated prediction of a solar transit, centuries before it was confirmed by telescope. These stories don't fit neatly into history books. They are scattered, fragmented, passed like fragile constellations across the generations. But they matter, because long before stargazing became a field of study, it was an act of courage. To question the heavens was to question hierarchy. To measure the cosmos was to resist being told that only priests or kings understood time. These astronomers were not rebels. They were not saints. They were meticulous, anxious, tired people trying to make sense of the sky, armed only with patience and parchment. And that's why they were dangerous. Because once you map the stars, it becomes harder to believe the darkness is unknowable. And the more people believe that, the less power fear holds. So they watched, calculated, whispered corrections. To the universe, their names may have been erased, but their work, it kept moving forward, quietly, like the planets they studied. And now, centuries later, you lie beneath the same sky. The same constellations blink overhead. The same eclipses cycle on schedule. The same geometry governs your seasons, your shadows, your sense of time. Somewhere in that celestial rhythm is the echo of their pens scratching wax. their breath fogging up brass instruments, their tired eyes squinting into starlight. Not to conquer, not to own, but to understand. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember the stars were never silent. It just took the forgotten to listen. The sun had long since retreated behind the rooftops of Cordoba, casting the whitewashed courtyards in a wash of indigo and deep ochre. On this quiet evening, the narrow alleyways no longer echoed with the voices of merchants or the calls of street criers. Instead, a sacred silence fell, an hour reserved for contemplation, for the polishing of thought. And it was in that silence that the breath of science truly stirred. Beyond the grand mosque and the tiled arcades of the souk, there lay a modest domed structure built from honey-colored stone. Its unassuming facade belied the wonder within. This was the home and observatory of Yahya al-Mu'tamid, a name whispered in the libraries of Toledo, the bazaars of Marrakesh, and the courts of Cairo, a mathematician, philosopher, and above all, a stargazer of uncommon devotion. Yahya had made it his life's work to map not just the heavens, but the unseen language beneath their motion. By candlelight and the trembling blue of dusk, he sat before a parchment the size of a tabletop. His ink was mixed with indigo dye from distant India. His quill the trimmed feather of a stork he'd once rescued from the Guadalquivir's flooded banks. Every line he drew curved not with flourish, but with meaning circles for planetary paths, nested ellipses for orbits yet to be proved, and numerals etched in the silent mathematics that govern celestial logic. The Andalusian night, unlike any other, offered clarity, not just of sky, but of mind. Unlike the damp mists of the north or the smoky haze of crowded metropolises, Cordoba's skies remained unblemished, a dome of black satin pierced with flame. The ancients had once believed the stars were holes, punched through the heavens. Yahya knew better, but even he felt that staring upward was like glimpsing a language older than Babel itself, his instruments delicate and burnished with age rested nearby. There was the bronze astrolabe, whose circular plates told the position of the stars at every hour of every night, each symbol etched with the same loving precision found in poetry. There were armillary spheres, layered with thin rings that turned, like the gears of the cosmos. Even a sandglass, refined with black volcanic glass grains from Sicily, ticked away the minutes as he marked a new position of Mars against the fixed stars. And all the while, silence. Silence, save for the soft scrapes of quill on parchment. Silence, but for the occasional rustling of date palm fronds outside, brushing the air like the turning pages of a divine manuscript. Yahya's apprentice, a soft-footed youth named Salman, crept in bearing a brass tray with rose water and honeyed almonds. He did not speak. He knew better. But he lingered, just long enough to watch his master adjust a sighting tube toward Al-Hina, the blue star that trembled just above the horizon. Yahya's hands were slow and reverent, as though aligning a holy relic. Then he exhaled, took a measurement, and nodded in solemn approval. What Yahya was assembling was not simply a chart. It was a mirror of the celestial order, drawn with an obsession for accuracy that bordered on mystical. And in a time when Christian scribes still debated the age of the earth in centuries, and monks feared the movement of Saturn, Yahya was drawing near to truths that would not be fully grasped until centuries later, even as Europe trembled in the fog of the early Dark Ages. Andalusia breathed knowledge like incense. Its caliphs funded observatories and opened libraries. Jewish scholars translated Greek works into Arabic. Christian monks came in secret to study under Muslim polymaths. And in this tangled web of cultures, Yahya thrived not as a man of a single religion, but as a servant to knowledge. He remembered the words of his father, whispered into his ear the night he turned 10. The stars do not care what faith you follow, but they reward the mind that seeks them purely. And Yahya had never turned away since. Each evening, his students gathered on the tiled rooftop, where the scent of jasmine mixed with the warmth of clay bricks. From there, they watched Venus rise in the west, shimmering like a polished mirror cast adrift in the sky. Yahya would speak quietly, pointing not just at constellations, but at their meaning, the precision of their return, the clockwork of their patterns. This, he would say, is not magic, but neither is it merely math. It is a bridge between the mind of man and the mind of God. Beneath their feet, the city cooled. Bakers closed their clay ovens. Merchants fastened the last bolts of silk behind shutters. The muezzin's final call echoed faintly across the river. But on that rooftop, time paused. Students would lean forward with open scrolls, and Yahya's fingers would trace the sky like a master painter across canvas. Some students came from distant lands, Baghdad, Samarkand, Granada. One girl, Layla, had fled Cordoba's political unrest after her father's death, seeking sanctuary and knowledge. Yahya had offered both. He did not judge her for her questions, only insisted they be sharp, persistent, and honest one night. As the moon rose blood-red through the haze, Layla asked, "Why do the stars return, even after chaos below?" Yahya smiled gently and turned to her with tired but brilliant eyes. "Because the stars are not watching us, we are watching them." It was not arrogance that drove his work, nor was it simple curiosity. It was devotion. Yahya believed the heavens held answers to questions man had not yet learned to ask. He studied planetary retrograde, not for astrology, but for evidence proof that no god would design a chaotic universe. The orbits, the inclinations, the long ellipses, they all hinted at something deeper, something exquisite in its precision. His latest treatise, The Ecliptic Harmonies of the Known Spheres, was nearing completion. With it, he hoped to challenge Ptolemy's models, correct certain Greek misconceptions, and propose elliptical planetary motion, a heretical idea to some. But Yahya feared no backlash. Truth, he believed, was its own armor. Each night, as ink dried and lamps dimmed, he climbed to the observatory's highest platform. There, wrapped in a woolen shawl, he would recline and simply watch, not with instruments, not with calculations, but with his eyes alone. A scholar, yes, but also a dreamer. A man who found joy in the symmetry of Cassiopeia, the sweeping wings of Cygnus, the cold, calm blink of Saturn. Below, the city hummed softly with nocturnal life, a cart's creaking wheel, distant laughter, the lapping of river water against stone. But Yahya heard only the soft music of the cosmos chords, played not in sound, but in pattern and movement. The stars did not answer. They never did. But they returned each night like faithful messengers, blinking down through time, unchanged by the rise and fall of kings or the burning of libraries. Even should his name be lost, his charts destroyed, his books forgotten, he knew that the sky would bear witness, and maybe, centuries hence, when another soul turned their eyes upward in the same thirst for meaning, they would unknowingly trace the same lines, seek the same truths, and wonder, just as he did, what quiet intelligence lay behind it all. In this way, Yahya al-Mu'tamad did not live for legacy. He lived for alignment, not just of stars, but of thought. the quiet certainty that to understand the heavens was, in some small way, to understand the self. And as the last candle in the observatory flickered, and Mars crept behind the minaret, Yahya closed his eyes not in sleep, but in peace. The sky watched him, silent and eternal. In the quiet shadows of the Alhambra's marbled halls, under arches heavy with jasmine-scented air and stars that flickered like the breath of a dreaming world, the science of the heavens danced in whispered secrecy. Granada, now in the twilight of its golden age, pulsed with subdued elegance, veiled in twilight veils and woven silk riddles. It was no longer the dawn-lit empire of the Umayyads, nor the blazing mid-morning court of Cordoba. It was the soft hush of evening, sophisticated, dignified, and unknowingly ephemeral. Within that quiet dusk, scholars still murmured secrets to the stars. One such scholar, Abu Zayd al-Nasiri, had left Cordoba behind years ago. Now grey of beard, and gentled by years of devotion, he lived among the gardens of the Alhambra, beside murmuring fountains and lemon trees. Where time bent like the curve of an astrolabe's arm, Abu Zayd had once studied beneath the legendary Qasim al-Tusi, inheriting his unfinished star maps, those strange, sweeping parchments inked with silver patterns and calculations that seemed to breathe with cosmic longing. These were no ordinary star charts. They were predictions, not of fate, but of future alignment, planetary irregularities, possible celestial comets that even the Chinese and Indian stargazers had only whispered about in passing. Night after night, Abu Zayd stood at his courtyard observatory, wrapped in woolen robes, eyes reflecting stars, fingers curled around a copper quadrant. He had become obsessed with the idea that the heavens operated in recursive cycles, not simple, repetitive loops, but spirals, elegant, expanding rhythms that mirrored music rather than mechanism. This theory whispered, scribbled in margins, sung in prayer like Hamzwas, what he called Korb Idi Aldor, the harmonic rule of return. The Sultan of Granada, Muhammad X, had once granted Abu Zayd a private chamber above the Comares Tower, where the sky looked like an ocean of ink spattered with powdered sugar. There, Zayd traced stellar spirals across sheepskin parchment, composing what he claimed would one day be known as Andalusia's last sky, a map not of the past, but of a future sky, hundreds of years ahead, drawn in such detail that it would outlast the towers themselves. Yet even in this poetic solitude, peril tiptoed on sandal feet. The Reconquista crept closer like wind beneath a tent flap, and with it came inquisitors who mistook knowledge for sorcery, who feared calculations more than they feared sin. The Nasrid Sultan, knowing the delicate thread upon which his court balanced, began distancing himself from those whose brilliance might provoke fire from across the Christian frontier. One evening, a courier arrived with dust on his boots and a scroll in his sleeve. It was from an old colleague of Zayd Esifatsima, bint al-Karin, once his student, now an astronomer at the Madrasat al-Makaria in Fez. She had studied his harmonic rule and believed it mirrored recent Sufi concepts of cosmic breath, the inhale and exhale of the universe. She begged him to leave Granada, to bring his scrolls southward, where Maranad libraries still breathed and books still lived. But Zayd could not leave. His tools, his quadrant, the tower, the patterns of the Alhambras Muqarnas vault saw, of it was entwined with his work. The geometry of Granada whispered back to the stars. If he left, the pattern would be broken. The song silenced. Instead, he redoubled his efforts by candlelight and moonbeam. He charted out his final theorem, a convergence in the year 1504, a moment when the lunar apogee and Mars's retrograde motion would harmonize in a way no astrolabe had ever captured. According to his calculations, the gravitational impact of this moment could alter earthly tides and possibly affect climate itself. He was not claiming divine intervention, only that the sky, like an oud string, sometimes vibrated just so. He sealed this parchment with beeswax, tied it in silk, and sent it by caravan to Fatima, along with a simple note: "If I vanish, let this survive." Meanwhile, in the alcoves of the Alhambra, gossip stirred. A Castilian agent had been seen wandering the outer halls in disguise, his eyes lingering too long on Arabic manuscripts, and not 2 weeks later, a senior court official confronted Zayd, warning him that his theories were being misread by hostile eyes. Some claimed he was trying to summon storms. Others believed his harmonic rule to be a code for rebellion. Zayd knew it was only a matter of time. That night, he took his remaining charts and pressed them into hollow compartments beneath the floor. Tiles of the tower, on the back of one scroll, he scrawled a message in Latin, hoping that someone, one day, would be able to translate what the heavens had whispered to him. The stars do not predict, they remember, and what they remember, they repeat. Then, like a shadow folding inward, he vanished from the tower. Some say he fled to North Africa. Others believe he was taken by the Inquisition. But the tower remained, and so did the tiles. And beneath them, the scrolls waited silent, forgotten, resting beneath the whisper of fountain water and the breath of jasmine. Years passed. The Catholic monarchs entered Granada in 1492. The city surrendered. Its libraries were seized. Its scholars scattered. Smoke curled from the Albaycin quarter as manuscripts were thrown into fires, their delicate pages curling like dried petals. It was a silence unlike any that had come before. But not every scroll had been found. Not every theory destroyed. A century later, in 1602, a Jesuit scholar named Mateo de Acuna, fascinated by strange legends of the Alhambra, uncovered an odd tile in the Comares Tower, loosened by an earthquake. Beneath it, a compartment trap, concealed, still intact. Inside, brittle scrolls and a copper quadrant. Mateo could read Arabic. He spent the next 30 years studying the fragments in secret, trying to reconstruct the harmonic rule. He was never able to prove Zayd's theorem, but what he did confirm changed the way he saw both the heavens and the past. That centuries before Galileo, before Kepler, before Newton, a man had stood atop a tower in southern Spain and predicted motion, not with dogma, but with rhythm, with music, with the breath of stars. Andalusia's last sky never made it into official textbooks. The church dismissed Mateo's findings as speculative poetry, but the quadrant ended up in a museum in Florence, labeled simply, "Unusual Moorish Instrument," and the scrolls, brittle and worn, were boxed and forgotten in a Jesuit archive, waiting once more for eyes that could read the memory of stars. So tonight, as you lie back and close your eyes, imagine the Alhambra beneath a moon that glows like a silver secret. Picture an old man tracing spirals in candlelight, listening not for answers, but for echoes. And know that in some forgotten tower, beneath faded tiles and murmuring stone, history still listens, not for what is gone, but for what might return. In the dim heart of the great mosque of Cordoba, where sunlight filtered like threads of golden silk through 100 horseshoe arches, the air often hummed with reverent silence. That sacred silence was broken not by chants or prayer, but by the scratch of reed pens on parchment, by murmurs in Latin, Arabic, and Greek a symphony of minds attempting to pull order from the cosmos. These were not men of the sword, nor merchants of silver, but those who charted the stars in silence, the quiet visionaries who once shaped the skies of Andalusia. Among them was the elusive Ormodreti, whose name had begun to echo beyond Cordoba's sandstone walls. He was no longer the guarded apprentice, cloistered behind the brass astrolabe of his youth. Now, his calculations were whispered by scholars in Alexandria, Toledo, and even Sicily. He had become the cartographer of the celestial, translating the heavens into systems, values, and precise rhythms that aligned not only with prayer but with agriculture, sea travel, and the very perception of time. It was a still evening in early spring when Madreti's eyes turned toward a problem older than his city, the aberration in planetary movement. Greek models, inherited and revered, spoke of perfect circles and crystalline spheres, but the data compiled by Andalusian astronomers with Persian and Indian texts whispered a more complex song. The stars moved with subtle deviation, curves within curves, epicycles looping like the tracery of vines on palace tiles. That night, with the fragrance of jasmine riding through the lattice windows of his observatory, Madreti did not pray to be right. He prayed to understand. With oil lamp flickering beside charts marked with the red ink of Mars and the blue of Venus, he traced the patterns again, 1,000th time, until his fingers felt like extensions of the stars themselves. What he began to uncover were not errors in the heavens, but errors in human perception. The cosmos, he began to suspect, was not built on symmetry, but on rhythm, on patterned deviation, like the music of an oud. He turned to his apprentice, a boy named Yunus, with eyes bright as burnished copper, and began dictating his findings. "Write this carefully, my son," he said, voice steady but soft. "The perfection of the heavens is not in their stillness, but in their movement. Like breath, like heartbeat, they shift, and in that shift lies the divine logic." Elsewhere, in Andalusia, the moon traced silver shadows across the Alhambra's marble pools, reflecting not the political unrest brewing in Christian kingdoms to the north, but the tranquil gaze of scholars who pondered the moon not as a symbol, but as a subject. For them, the moon was a mirror both literally and metaphorically, phases anchoring calendars, agricultural patterns, and fasting days. They knew that its gravitational pull affected tides, but some suspected it might even sway human mood and thought. In the city of Almeria, along the coast where Phoenician ruins crumbled quietly under the waves, a small group of female scholases, women cloaked in scholarly secrecy, gathered by torchlight to share lunar observations. Among them was Zainab al-Rakika, who had inherited not only her father's scrolls, but his discipline. She studied reflections in still water as if they were the very face of the cosmos, scribbling theories that whispered through future generations like forgotten verses. She, too, questioned, accepted wisdom not out of arrogance, but out of devotion. "The moon," she once wrote in calligraphy so fine it could have been spider silk, "holds our dreams in its crescents, but also our calculations. It is the pendulum of Earth's breath." Meanwhile, in the monastery libraries of Galicia, where manuscripts were copied in cold stone cloisters, Christian monks quietly translated the texts of these Andalusian astronomers. They attributed the words to infidels, but could not deny their clarity, their logic. A monk named Pedro de Luna made careful copies of Almadriti's works, though he changed the author's name to Ptolemaeus Novus, fearing ecclesiastical punishment. Still, in the margin, he dared write, "Never have I seen the stars so well explained, Far to the east, Persian scholars marveled at the precision of Andalusian eclipse tables. To them, it felt like Spain had become a second Alexandria. They sent emissaries westward with brass instruments and sharpened questions. And, though political maps marked the Caliphate of Cordoba as separate from Baghdad or Samarkand, the sky showed no such boundaries. Andalusia had become the middle voice of a vast intellectual harmony, translating the old, refining the inherited, and proposing the new. Its scholars were not alone, but they were pivotal. Their observatories stood like sentinels, not of war, but of knowledge. Back in Cordoba, Madriti worked on what would become one of his most influential contributions, a corrected astronomical table that accounted for precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. Using methods that would seem impossibly advanced for his time, he calculated the gradual shift in the position of stars over centuries. The sky, he wrote, is not a stage of fixed lights, but a river of shifting truths. Only patience reveals its current. By then, Madriti had students from as far as the Maghrib and the Italian peninsula. They brought with them not only languages and dialects, but also questions. Why did stars appear to rise earlier each year? Could eclipses be predicted with greater accuracy? Why did comets defy every model? Madriti welcomed their doubts like an orchard welcomes spring rain. To him, every question was an invitation to refine the lens of human perception. In the upper levels of the observatory, carved from polished cedar and perfumed with frankincense, Yunus now stood at the helm. Madriti had aged, his eyes dimmed by decades of starlight, but his mind remained sharp. Yunus carried his master's vision with humility. Together, they began work on a grand compilation, the Book of Celestial Paths. It would not only explain planetary movement, but suggest ways to predict atmospheric changes, link astronomical patterns to earthly rhythms, and argue, softly but firmly, that reason was not the enemy of faith, but its highest expression. Outside the walls of the observatory, Cordoba's golden age trembled with subtle instability. Power struggles whispered through palace halls. Foreign ambassadors came and went with tense smiles. The river Guadalquivir flowed indifferent, as it had for millennia, carrying reflections of the same stars the scholars observed above. Still, the astronomers worked. They worked not for glory, nor for gold, but for the silence that followed understanding, the sacred hush when an equation revealed more than numbers, when a model aligned with reality, when the stars no longer seemed distant but familiar. They worked because to map the sky was to map humanity's place in it, and to do so was, in their quiet minds, an act of devotion as holy as prayer in their hands. Astronomy was not science alone, it was memory, wonder, and whispered communion. And though centuries would try to forget them, though time would scatter their parchments like dry leaves in desert winds, the stars would always remember. For the stars, you see, never forget those who named them with care. Andalusia may sleep now, its minarets quiet and its instruments rusted in museums. But in that sleep lies a rhythm still beating like the gentle ticking of celestial clocks, like the echo of a forgotten astronomer brushing dust from his lens, beneath the jasmine-scented night. And, if you lie quietly tonight, far from Cordoba, far from Almeria, and watch the moon trace silver paths across your ceiling, you might feel what they once felt, that in every breath of the sky there is a lesson still waiting to be learned. Let the heavens speak now. The stars are whispering again. In the waning golden hours of a Roman afternoon, the city of Rome shimmered like a mosaic in motion. Sunlight filtered through columns of travertine and bounced off the polished bronze shields of idle praetorians. The air held the scent of laurel and lavender, mingling with hints of spiced wine and olive oil simmering in kitchens tucked deep within the insulae. But beyond the marketplaces, Babel, past the scribes in the forums and the senators mumbling policy in the curia, a different world stirred in the shadows, quieter, more decadent, and infinitely more secretive. Behind a row of seemingly nondescript marble villas along the Palatine Hill, a torch flickered beside an arched doorway. Slaves in white tunics guided the chosen guests in silence, their eyes fixed to the ground, their expressions unreadable. Inside, the air thickened not just with incense, but with anticipation. The domus belonged to Gaius Varius Rufinus, a patrician of ambiguous fortune and carefully veiled habits. He was neither philosopher nor politician, yet his home had become legend, crucible of indulgence, whispered about in the Senate and dreamt of in the barracks. Guests disrobed at the entrance, not entirely, but enough to melt the boundaries between citizen and creature. The rooms within glowed with soft lamplight. Walls bore frescoes, not of gods and heroes, but of dancers caught mid-motion. Lovers knotted in impossible embraces, fruit cascading from bowls, mouths agape in desire. Music drifted, played on citharas and flutes, soft and hypnotic, led by women, with kohl-rimmed eyes and hair plaited with pearls. The triclinium dining hall had been transformed into something mythic. Couches of ivory and panther hide circled a central table upon which no food yet sat. In its place, a young man with painted lips lay motionless, his body dusted with crushed rose petals. He did not flinch when touched, nor tremble when inspected. Gaius had named him Caro, meaning flesh. It was said he had fasted for 3 days and bathed in wine to ready his skin for the feast. One by one, the guests entered. A senator's wife, wrapped in silk, so fine it clung like mist. A merchant from Antioch with rings on every finger. A Vestal virgin in exile, her vow long broken. They settled into the curved silence with practiced ease. No names were exchanged, only glances, and the quiet understanding that what happened beneath this roof would never be spoken aloud. The servants moved like spirits unseen, perfectly timed. They brought trays, not of food, but of scent. Jars of ambergris, oils steeped in crushed figs and cinnamon, muslin pouches of powdered silver to dab on the tongue. Each guest partook, their senses slowly disengaging from time and custom, floating, now in a shared cloud of sensory overload. Then came the wind dark and red as a gladiator's wound, poured from amphorae whose sides bore warnings in Greek: drink slowly, remember to breathe. It was not the usual Falernian, nor even the sweet cetin favored by the empress. This had been steeped with lotus blossom and mandragora root. It warmed the limbs but did not dull the mind. If anything, it sharpened sensation, making touch feel electric and vision fluid. Caro stirred, not dramatically, but enough for the room to take notice. He rolled onto his side, petals clinging to his skin. From the shadows, a flute picked up a minor scale, trilling like the whisper of a new lover's breath. Caro extended a hand, beckoning not to any guest in particular, but to the room itself. It was a signal one that Gaius had devised to initiate the Apulian senses. The banquet of senses. Dishes appeared, but not to be eaten in the traditional sense. Instead, they were ritualistic. A bowl of pomegranate seeds was handed from one guest to the next, each instructed to feed the person beside them without using their hands. The fruit burst between teeth, staining tongues crimson. Grapes peeled and chilled were rolled across the collarbones of a reclining woman before being dropped into waiting mouths. Quail eggs, dyed with saffron, were hidden within folds of linen and searched for with only lips. The air grew thicker still. Someone began to laugh, not out of humor, but the kind of laughter that rises when the ordinary is left far behind. From another room, a procession emerged, dancers, clothed in nothing but sheer veils, each holding a dish atop their head. One bore dates soaked in myrrh. Another carried oysters marinated in honey. A third offered candied lotus bulbs shaped like teardrops. No one spoke of hunger, because what they craved had little to do with nourishment. These were not meals but metaphors, edible theatre designed to loosen the moral ligatures of Rome, and loosen they did. Hands roamed, faces flushed, eyes remained half-lidded, as if looking at anything directly would break the spell. At the center of it all, Caro stood at last. A servant approached with a golden basin and perfumed cloth. He was bathed in front of everyone, but with no urgency. Limb gently lifted and wiped, each toe and finger attended with monastic care. The water that ran from him turned pink, then red. It was said the bath included wine and crushed rubies. Gaius claimed the sensation of cleansing with powdered gem, felt like being reborn. Now came the moment of the tongue ceremony. Plates were placed at each guest's side, teeny offerings of bee larvae wrapped in mint, calf's tongue sliced thin as silk, and morsels of spiced squid ink pasta rolled into bite-sized scrolls. But there was a rule: none could feed themselves. The game was intimacy and trust. Tongues met not always lips, but skin, belly, thigh. Each taste ignited a spark, a small surrender. Someone moaned, another wept. It wasn't carnal, at least not entirely. It was transcendent. To be fed was to be worshipped. To feed, a form of devotion. As moonlight seeped through the carved oculus above, the tempo changed. The flutes faded. A drumbeat began, slow and ancient. Gaius entered, robed in gold-threaded linen, his face painted like Bacchus in triumph. He held a candelabrum fashioned to resemble a many-headed hydra, its flames licking the air with golden tongues. Guests parted for him instinctively. He did not speak. He merely nodded on with that. The servants revealed the final offering of the night. It was not food, but sent a small brazier into which powdered resin was tossed. The smoke that rose was narcotic, pulled from the tombs of the East, where priests dreamt in darkness and awoke with prophecy on their lips. The guests inhaled. A collective sigh unfurled through the chamber like silk falling to the floor. Their bodies slackened. Some reclined, others embraced. All resistance, all distinction, all propriety melted into a single, shared haze. At this climax, Caro approached each one. He anointed foreheads with oil. He kissed mouths softly, reverently. He whispered names none of them recognized, but all felt belonged to them in some other life. It was not seduction, but sacrament. When he reached Gaius, he knelt, and Gaius, lifting his goblet high, murmured in Latin, "Let what is forgotten remain buried. Let what is sacred never be spoken." The guests slept where they lay, wrapped in linens that smelled of cinnamon and dreams. No one left until dawn, when the doors opened and the world returned, harsh and orderly, full of names and laws. Servants cleaned in silence. Caro disappeared back into the garden, where he would not be seen again until the next moon. By midday, rumors would stir. Someone had glimpsed a senator's signet ring on a bare shoulder. a poet would write a veiled verse about oil and honey in the shape of a man. A magistrate's wife would faint during confession, but none would name Gaius, nor Caro, nor the domus upon the Palatine hill. It remained a story half remembered, half invented, entirely yearned for, and so the sinful banquets continued, woven into the quiet pulse of Roman nights flickering, fevered, forbidden. For in the world's greatest empire, where laws governed gods and men alike, there still existed rooms where time collapsed, where the body ruled, and where history briefly exhaled. As the call to prayer echoed through the narrow corridors of Cordoba's inner city, Layla awoke to the rustle of parchment and the subtle scent of candle wax clinging to her robes. Morning sunlight, soft as silk, filtered through the ornate lattice windows of her studiettes, golden beams brushing over the ink-stained scrolls, ancient instruments and mosaic floor tiles that told stories of vanished empires. Her fingers, nimble with youth and tutored by old wisdom, traced the constellations, charted centuries ago by Al-Zakali and the Maslama brothers. The city outside stirred gently, but inside the domed chamber of the House of the Moon, only the heavens were loud. Each morning now, Layla greeted the stars as if they were old friends, though they had long since vanished from the night. She remembered the words of her mentor, Yusuf. We study not the stars themselves, but our memory of them. We search not for light, but for how we once believed in its guidance. With the fall of the last caliphate, many of the old libraries had been hidden, others destroyed. And still, secret rooms like this survive domed, like the firmament, tiled with the dust of forgotten minds, holding instruments more delicate than any cathedral's stained glass. Layla was not alone. She was part of a dwindling circle of clandestine scholars, descendants of astronomers, herbalists, and poets who had refused to let silence devour their skies. That morning, Yusuf had sent word, a coded message stitched within a linen thread, embedded inside the hem of her robe. She pulled it free and unwound it gently, revealing the smallest script she had ever read, written in the cipher of the old caliph's court. A map, coordinates, perhaps a promise. The mirrors beyond the walls reflect more than stars. Follow where the lions weep. She knew the phrase. It was spoken only in whispers, among those still loyal to the celestial order. It referred to the ancient ruins of Madinat al-Zahra, the once glorious palace of Abd al-Rahman III, city of marble and water, where lions once guarded the gardens of moonlight and symmetry. Now it lay in ruin, covered in weeds and rumor. But if Yusuf's message was true, then the hidden vault of instruments allegedly transported from Baghdad to escape the Mongol fires might still slumber beneath its foundations. She set out that afternoon, cloaked not in secrecy, but in the anonymity of a traveling scribe. Her satchel bore nothing suspicious. Dried figs, a copper astrolabe, fragments of a poem by Ibn Hazm, and a lens carved from polished obsidian. Her footsteps were quiet, rhythmic, mirroring the pulse of those who had walked before her, like shadows between tiled arches, beneath the Moorish palms, past the still chattering fountains that once recited verses from the Qur'an as she rode beyond the city's edge. Cordoba faded behind her like a memory half-remembered. The road to Madinat al-Zahra was nearly devoured by overgrowth, but the lions still stood headless now, yet proud at the gate of cracked ivory. Vines curled over their haunches like the fingers of time. Layla stepped beyond them, guided by instinct, history, and echo. Inside, the palace was a skeleton of elegance. The columns leaned as if tired from centuries of wind. The halls no longer smelled of jasmine and parchment, but of earth and stone. Yet the acoustics of the architecture still hummed when she whispered beneath its vaulted ceilings. Every sound, even a breath, rebounded with a hush of reverence. She found the chamber at dusk. It was hidden beneath a collapsed stairwell behind. A false wall carved with floral patterns so intricate they seemed to breathe. Yusef had left her another clue, this time burned into a palm leaf tucked behind an old corbel. Use the sun and the floor will open. She waited until the next afternoon when the sun was at its apex. Using the copper astrolabe and Yusuf's notes, she aligned the room's remaining columns with the solar arc. As light passed through a cracked crystal embedded high in the ceiling, it refracted onto the mosaic floor in a pattern of glowing shapes, forming, to her astonishment, the precise shape of Orion's belt. A low grinding sound shuddered through the room. The floor beneath her shifted, and with a gentle thud, a circular section lowered, revealing a spiral stairwell cloaked in cool darkness. Lantern in hand, Layla descended into the underworld of knowledge. The chamber below was untouched by wind or war. A vault of vaults. Rows of gleaming astrolabes hung like brass fruit from iron trees. Shelves bowed under the weight of scrolls wrapped in silks too faded to identify. And at the center, a great table carved from cedar and inlaid with lapis, a celestial map unlike any she had ever seen. Planets carved in sapphire orbited a silver sun. Each star was a pinpoint of gold leaf, arranged not according to myth or poetry, but mathematical precision. In one corner, etched faintly in Kufic script, was a phrase that made her inhale sharply. We were not the first to read the sky. We will not be the last. Layla wept, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming weight of rediscovery. Each tool, each scroll, each preserved relic was a voice reaching across time, asking only to be heard again. She lit every lantern in the chamber, the flames flickering to life like starlight being reborn. For days, she remained underground, copying diagrams by hand, comparing theories on lunar parallax, and studying equations penned in the margins by minds lost to history. There were star charts drawn from perspectives no longer visible, tools to measure orbits of celestial bodies beyond Saturn, and early musings on heliocentrism, penned centuries before Copernicus ever tilted his telescope skyward. But it was more than science. It was a preservation of hope, an archive of curiosity defying every regime that had tried to dim its flame. These astronomers, like Layla, had studied not for fame or reward, but because they believed that the stars held secrets worth uncovering, because even when empires fell, truth remained. On her final morning within the vault, Layla found a mirror. It was ancient, rimmed with gold, engraved with verses from the Mu'allaqat. But it wasn't glass. Its surface was obsidian, so dark it seemed to swallow light. When she peered into it, she didn't see herself. She saw stars, thousands of them, mapped in silver dust, dancing not in randomness, but in song. She realized then, this wasn't a tool for observation. It was a mnemonic device, a way for astronomers to memorize star fields through rhythm and reflection. Songs woven into mirrors, stories sung into equations. She packed what she could. Instruments small enough to hide, scrolls she could recite from memory, and the obsidian mirror, wrapped in cloth stitched with the House of the Moon's insignia. When she emerged, the light felt harsher than before, as if the surface world had grown impatient in her absence. But she did not walk alone. Behind her, the vault remained, hidden once more, not just beneath stone and time, but beneath the silence of those who knew when to guard a secret dot. In the months that followed, Layla traveled. She crossed the narrow sea into the Maghreb, then beyond, sharing fragments of her discoveries only with those who listened in awe, not ambition. She left notes in forgotten languages, star maps carved into the undersides of bridges, formulas woven into carpets. Wherever she went, the stars followed, burning not in the sky, but in the minds of those who dared to remember, and across the night skies of forgotten cities, when the wind shifted just right, children whispered her name like a constellation lost to official charts. Layla, daughter of the moon. Star, keeper of Andalusia. The scent of old brass, polished until it gleamed in the slanted sunlight, mingled with the dry aroma of ink, parchment, and worn leather. Within the outer chambers of the Al-Zarawi Quarters Observatory Complex, beneath the dome of the House of the Phoenix, ink-stained scholars with measured eyes and weathered fingertips debated not politics, nor kings, but the arrangement of the fixed stars, and whether the human soul too was subject to such celestial regulation. The nights had grown cooler. By the time the Andalusian hills turned amber with the approach of winter, yet within the belly of the observatory, warmth spread not from coals, but from minds alight with wonder. The older astronomers, the graying ones who remembered Baghdad's golden decades, and spoke of Persian libraries consumed by Mongol fire, became more generous with their memories. Each dusk, as shadows slipped like water across the domes, they unrolled ancient scrolls and invited the younger apprentices to sit at their feet. Among them sat Hassan, a boy no longer, his beard now edged with maturity, and his eyes darkened not by youth's mischief, but by responsibility. It had been 7 years since he first passed beneath the brass gates of Al-Zarawi, carrying nothing but a letter and a dream. He now held not just a stylus, but a seat at the table of discourse, beside the mathematicians who spoke in silent glances and the cartographers who inked entire star systems with trembling precision. Opposite him was Layla. She had arrived from Granada only 3 seasons earlier, sent by her uncle, a physician-philosopher who had once treated the Caliph of Cordoba's melancholia with amber beads, dried figs, and nightly recitations of Aristotelian texts. Layla came not merely as a visitor, but as an inheritor of a long intellectual line. Her questions, probing and sharp, made even the senior scholars tilt their heads in reconsideration. Layla was fascinated by planetary conjunctions, the strange geometry of orbits, and how, on rare occasions, heavenly bodies appeared to kiss across the night sky. For her, the cosmos was a living theatre, its drama not mythic but mathematical. She often sketched orbital diagrams long after the oil lamps had been extinguished, her fingers smudged with soot and her brow streaked with sweat. It was she who first proposed that the wandering stars, the planets, might not simply dance around the earth as long presumed, but around another central body altogether. The suggestion was blasphemy in certain courts, but within Al-Zarawi it sparked long nights of measured conversation. Not denial, never dismissal, but methodical dissection. Suppose the earth is not the hub of the wheel, Layla whispered once, leaning over the ancient armillary sphere, her breath forming mist on the cold brass. And suppose, Hassan replied gently, that such an idea does not unmake the divine, but only reveals his mechanisms in greater clarity. They worked side by side, not as rivals, but as mirrors, reflecting the best in each other. Where Hassan had grown precise in his tables, Layla brought abstraction, intuition. Together, they revised the eclipse predictions of earlier scholars, aligning them not just with moon phases, but tidal variations and wind patterns across the coast of the Maghreb. On nights of astronomical alignment, when the lunar disk passed near Saturn or Mars swelled red with proximity, the tower balconies filled with observers. Silks and scarves flapped like birds in the wind as noblemen, merchants, and shepherds alike crowded to glimpse the sky through al-Zarawi's great bronze lens. Hassan would guide them with a calm voice, his hand pointing through layers of glass and shadow. But Layla preferred the quiet of the upper dome. Alone, she would track starlight across her parchment, calculating minor perturbations with a pebble-weighted abacus and a set of polished ivory calipers once owned by a Jewish scholar from Cairo. Then came the year of the Great Silence, for reasons no one understood. The stars seemed to dim, not to the eye, but in their behavior. The expected alignments came minutes late. A lunar eclipse failed to appear. Venus glowed brighter than any scroll had recorded. The city buzzed with superstition whispers of comets, of omens, of dynastic change. A minor noble claimed his orchard bore fruit in winter. A traveller from Byzantium spoke of 2 suns seen at dawn. Inside al-Zarawi, the scholars did not panic. They calculated. Dozens of charts were revised. Ancient Babylonian methods were re-examined. Even the Hermetic texts, often considered more mystic than scientific, dusted off and read aloud in twilight tones. Hassan and Layla took it upon themselves to test an old theory, found in a tattered Latin fragment sent by a merchant who traded salt for books in Genoa. The theory proposed a minor planetary body unseen and slow that occasionally perturbed the visible orbits with its subtle gravity. To test this, they built a new lens, longer than any before, requiring copper, smelted in Seville and glass ground for weeks by hand. When complete, it stood like a great cannon pointed skyward, its barrel glinting with frost at dawn. What they saw one night after months of calibration was not a body. Not quite. It was a shadow, not cast, but moving. Not obstructing light, but bending it. A distortion. They repeated the observation. Once, twice, thrice, each time, the anomaly appeared. Layla's hand trembled as she noted its coordinates. Hassan cross-referenced star maps. The object of it could be called that traveled, not across the firmament like a comet, but within it, like a ripple in water. They called it the Ripple Star. When they presented their findings, the room fell to hush, not disbelief, but awe. Some argued it was a flaw in the lens. Others proposed it was evidence of the crystalline spheres spoken of by Plato's celestial layers upon which stars were affixed, now revealed in motion. A few murmured darker things, that perhaps the firmament itself was shifting, that the divine architecture had begun to move, but most were silent. And in that silence, consensus emerged. The cosmos was not fixed. It breathed, moved, changed. The Ripple Star, or whatever it was, came to symbolize a greater truth, that knowledge, like the sky, expands with every careful observation, every bold hypothesis, every long night spent in dialogue with silence. The scrolls of al-Zarawi were amended, new diagrams added. A margin note by Layla reads, "Perhaps the stars do not move in circles, but in spirals, towards some center yet unknown." Years later, a passing cartographer would carry their findings to Alexandria, where it would inspire the reform of celestial tables. Another would bring it eastward to Samarkand, where a sultan's grandson fascinated by the stars, would build an observatory modeled after Al-Zarawi's dome. But in Cordoba, where our tale roots itself, the observatory remained a sanctuary of thought. No fire, no blade, no decree had touched it yet. And within its dome, even now, under stars that tremble with unknown motion, Hassan and Layla continued to map the future with ink, intellect, and quiet certainty. For to understand the sky was never to master it tonally, to listen more carefully to its eternal murmur. In the final stretch of twilight, when the call to Fajr echoed softly over the whitewashed minarets, and the last stars trembled in the hush of the Andalusian sky, the scholars of the Meristan Observatory stood for one last night beneath the firmament that had defined their lifetimes. The ink of centuries had been inscribed upon the stars, and now the final script was to be written in silence. They had gathered in quiet understanding. Ishak al-Mutamid, older now, his eyes veiled with mist, but still lifting to the heavens. Beside him, young Rama, his apprentice, now a scholar in her own right, her fingers trembling as she traced the carvings on the last astrolabe. Even Bakr, the calligrapher of stars, had laid aside his reed pen, his scrolls rolled up, as if sealing the knowledge in parchment for a future age that might never come. Outside the walls of Granada, the winds of war and exile whispered. The Christian crowns had drawn their borders tight, and the courtly patronage that had once fed their astronomy had been replaced by silence, suspicion, and closed doors. But inside the Meristan, candles flickered like tiny galaxies, and the great brass armillary sphere turned once more, slowly, as if bidding farewell. Ishak stood before his students and companions for what they knew would be the final lesson. No longer would they calculate the lunar calendar for Ramadan, or predict eclipses with the precision of reason and ink. The scrolls would be hidden, buried, or smuggled across seas, perhaps to Istanbul, perhaps to Marrakesh, or maybe nowhere. But before the knowledge could scatter, it had to be distilled into something more eternal than paper. Memory, my friends, Ishak said, his voice a whisper wrapped in reverence. The stars remember us even when empires forget. They listened, their eyes not on him, but above him, through the great open archway that framed the night sky like a window into infinity. The constellation of Virgo, delicate and serene, hovered directly above the marble floor. She had always been Rama's favorite. Tonight, she blinked faintly in a curtain of dusk. Ishak continued, we were custodians, not of conquest or gold, but of light measured light, celestial rhythm, the hush between stars. We made silence speak. In the courtyard, the last of the water clocks had stilled. Its shallow basin reflected both the moon and the crumbling dome above, where paint flaked off in delicate golden threads. Beneath that dome, the last of the oris clicked shut with a gentle sigh. Rama came forward and unfurled a chart, her final one. It was not on papyrus, not on vellum. She had etched it into tile, ceramic glazed and burnt by fire. A map of the heavens above Granada on this very night, rendered in blue and silver. She placed it at the feet of the great armillary, like a final offering to time. I will not run, she said, her voice a soft defiance. Let them take the observatory, but let the stars take me. But Ishak shook his head gently, and for once his voice softened not with warning but love. No, daughter of the stars, you must carry them onward. They will not kill knowledge if it lives in you. You are our last manuscript. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with everything they had once calculated. Parallax, declination, planetary epicycles, and prayers turned skyward. a science made holy by its elegance. As dawn began to bloom across the hills of Albazin and Sacramonte, the group stood in prayer not of religion, but of remembrance. They recited the names of those before them, Al-Zarqali, whose astrolabe changed the world, Al-Battani, who charted the heavens in Syria, and Marwan, who once sat under this same dome, laughing beneath Saturn's transit. They recited until the names faded, and only silence remained. And when the sun finally crested the ridges of the Sierra Nevada, casting golden light across the ivory tiles and broken arches, the Meristan Observatory fell into shadow forever. The gates closed. The court, now Catholic, would never open them again. But far away, months later, in the Medina of Fez, a girl with starlight in her eyes sat before a crowd of children. She unrolled a tile wrapped in linen, her tile, the chart of a night in Granada long gone, and as she pointed to the symbols and began to speak in slow, rhythmic tones, explaining the dance of the stars, the songs of comets, the time marked by lunar breath, the children listened, wide-eyed. The story of the forgotten astronomers had not ended. It had only changed form in the centuries to come. Rama's students would write books in the Maghreb, then pass them on to travelers in Ottoman libraries. Others would reach India, their diagrams translated and recopied. One copy would find its way to Florence, its margins stained with saffron ink and stars drawn by hand. A Jesuit scholar in Prague would use their planetary tables to challenge Ptolemy. A Persian poet would write verses about stars named in Andalusian breath. And a modern-day historian, centuries later, sleepless under electric light, would stumble across a name etched in a fragment of tile from Granada signed in a looped, deliberate hand, RAL-MARIST and IYYA. He would pause, then smile faintly, because even when the world forgets, the stars do not. So sleep now, traveler. Let the rhythm of the skies cradle you. Let constellations drift like dreams over your closed eyes. For somewhere above us, always and forever, the astronomers are still watching, still whispering, still measuring light across the silence of time. And that is where we leave them, beneath the stars, above the world, unforgotten.